But the reality is that mental health is so critical to leading lives of flourishing and vitality and meaning and agency and people being able to do the things that are important to them.
They didn't actually fully integrate into the public health infrastructure, but it really did reach that national impact.
The scale of mental health need cannot be met by a single provider, an NGO, and certainly our sector being the smallest one.
Those of us who are prejudiced about government really need to start thinking and rethinking all over again, because actually government does carry the responsibility of working with its citizens long term.
It's not about arriving at a perfect model. It's about staying present within the process. And I think that really comes through in your report.
If we can successfully integrate this into the public sector, then a few really great things might happen in our life. Millions of people experiencing more flourishing and well-being and positive mental health. So isn't that worth a shot?
I feel like if I had a mic, I would drop it.
Welcome to Mind the Gap, a podcast about what's missing in global mental health.
I'm Christy Savetta.
I'm Chris Underhill.
And we're here to explore the stories, solutions, and systems shaping mental health around the world.
From community champions to global change makers.
Let's dive into what's working and what's not.
And what it'll take to close the gap.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Mind the Gap. We are really excited to be meeting with Daisy Rosales and Sue Balasubramanian today, who are going to talk to us about their recent research published as a report in Catalyst Now. Daisy and Sue, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's so great to be here. Thank you so much.
Before we dive in, actually, Chris, do you want to give us a brief overview of what we might hear today?
Sure. So we're here today to talk about a really interesting report. It's called Scaling Mental Health Access, Case Studies and Practices for Public Sector Integration, written by Daisy and Sue. As you might know, it's long been understood that in order to genuinely scale mental health services, the government needs to get involved. And this report really brings that to light. By the way, we're going to put a link on our own website, Mind the Gap website, so that you can click on it and get the document for yourself in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. Christy.
That's incredible. I can't wait to get into it in English today, but I can't wait to get into it. Really excited. Daisy and Sue, let's start with you two. Can you guys introduce yourselves a little bit? Sue, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So I've spent a couple of decades working in the international development sector and more recently as a mental health clinician, and have kind of been steeped in these areas around mental health and public health and systems change, and particularly have worked across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so my background's really sort of in psychotherapy and social innovation and social marketing. And so I've had the opportunity of working with governments, nonprofits, and other institutions to really design programs at the community level that really kind of center the users and the humans in that experience, and making sure that those programs are built to last. So I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk about how we can really evolve and not really exit when it comes to scaling mental health solutions through public and private partnerships.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Sue. We're so happy to have you with us today. Daisy, can I ask you to introduce yourself as well, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the co-founder and executive director of Brio, and we partner with civil society organizations and their communities to design contextualized mental health promotion programs that are based in an evidence-based framework called ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Training. And we've been doing this for almost 7 years now, and we've worked with amazing organizations and leaders in Latin America, parts of Asia, and the United States. And we really believe that not only is mental health relevant to pretty much everyone, but especially in the social sector, where organizations and leaders and teams are serving marginalized communities. These communities often bear the burden of oppression and violence for generations, and therefore their mental health is especially at risk. We also know that with climate change and a lot of the other geopolitical shifts we're seeing now, mental health is more relevant than ever. So we're really excited to be here to talk about how we can make it more accessible to everyone.
Thank you very much, Daisy. In fact, could I jump straight in with a question for you? What inspires you to start thinking about this subject, the interconnection between the world of the not for profit in mental health, the need to reach more people, or to scale for that matter, and the whole complicated business of working within a government framework?
Well, we know now through a very recent study conducted by the University of Queensland in Australia and also by Harvard, that 1 in 2 people globally are expected to be at risk for a mental health condition at some point in their lives. No, that's enormous. That's half the world's population, right? And so, the scale of mental health need cannot be met by a single provider, an NGO, and certainly our sector being the smallest one, cannot meet the scale of global need. But the reality is that mental health is so critical to leading lives of flourishing and vitality and meaning and agency and people being able to do the things that are important to them. Meanwhile, you've got governments, and governments serve some of the most vulnerable populations, and it aims to do so at scale. Government has more infrastructure than most local organizations or even NGOs most of the time. And they are tasked with delivering services like education and health and other local community initiatives as well. And so, thinking about the reach and the infrastructure of government, and the systems that are in place, it is a natural question of, how do we integrate mental health into what the government is offering? Seems to make a lot of sense. I think on the other side, there's also the reality that as social innovators, myself included, we're often encouraged to build something and hand it off to someone else to replicate it. And that's a nice sort of punchline at the end of the story, thinking like, well, you build something, hand it over, then you're done. But just because it's a good idea doesn't mean it's necessarily straightforward or easy in the process at all. And so Sue and I wanted to do some investigation. Some of this is certainly from our own experience of working to integrate programs that we've designed with various government entities. But we also wanted to look around the world and see, how do people actually do this? And what is that process? What are some of the practices that have worked well? And also, what are some of the challenges that get in the way?
Makes a ton of sense. Absolutely. And I'm wondering, with mental health, I mean, it's incredible because it's akin to nutrition and sanitation, or it should be in a sense that it's cross-cutting. It affects everybody and should be present always. So I'm really curious to kind of dive into how you studied the dynamics that are kind of a part of that cross-cutting nature. So kind of before we get into that though, Sue, I'm curious, how did you guys go about organizing this research?
Yeah, it's a great question. And kind of just as Daisy mentioned, we wanted to look at some best practices, but before even figuring out, how to go about that, we did our own literature review to see what is really out there in terms of people talking about governments and mental health at all, and where are some of the gaps. And what we really learned are there were not a lot of people out there who are talking about um, how to partner with governments when thinking about mental health, and especially thinking about taking innovation to scale. And so that's really where, as Daisy referenced as well, we wanted to search for these examples of best practices, of different ways in which different organizations or individuals were really successful in being able to partner with governments. And so we we looked for examples, you know, and I'm laughing a little bit because, in some of this, Daisy in particular had to do a lot of sleuthing to find some of these contact information for some of the folks who were heading some of these great programs. But we looked for examples that were diverse across geography and sector. And that was really important to us because we wanted to make sure that, our findings were representative and that weren't just narrowly about, health or narrowly about education. But we wanted to look across and across geography too. So we wanted to make sure that we were cross continental as well. And so were able to find 7 great examples of different organizations partnering with governments. And we split out the interviews with representatives from each of those organizations. And then we got to use one of my favorite tools, which is Mural. It's an online collaboration tool where we were able to theme all of these different insights and the learning that was coming out of all of the interviews that we had. And that's really what led to, the best practices that are in the report as well that have come out, as well as the innovate, integrate, and sustain framework that has come out of all of this research, as well as how these different examples fit across that spectrum as well.
Let me just jump in there. You mentioned the innovate, integrate, sustain framework. You noticed I said it slower to get it right. And I was just going to ask you, Daisy, what tends to get lost or diluted as programs move from innovation into government systems? And how can we hold on to that essence, what is essential?
Yeah. So what tends to happen is that, so we've talked about this three-phase framework, and there is movement between the different phases, and multiple phases may be happening at one time. It's a lot easier to visualize it in the report itself. But essentially, there may be an innovative program that is designed to be implemented eventually in a government-based system, whether that is a school-based system, health-based system, a local community, culture-based system, whatever that might be. And eventually, there is this need to hand that program over to the system and have the system deliver it. Um, and the reality is that if it starts off as a program that is being delivered primarily by the social innovator and the NGO, or even just a smaller subset of the public system that is being, partnered with to deliver this program, some people worry about a few different kinds of things that can be lost as it goes to scale. The first one would be around fidelity to a model. So essentially, how well is the implementation going, and how much tolerance is there for something to be delivered not as perfectly as it probably would be by people who are experts in the field who've been doing it for many years. Because that's not the assumption that when integrating into a government system, that people are trained to the level of an NGO that is specializing, for example, in mental health, right? And so one way to address this kind of fidelity question, especially if you've run lots of evaluations on it, maybe you've done an RCT and there's a protocol and all these different things that kind of have to function a certain way. We think almost mechanistically. In order for the effects to be what we want them to be. And this is a big concern for a lot of NGOs, funders, and governments. One thing to really think about from the outset is to design programs for the system, knowing that these programs are going to have to tolerate a really wide range of implementation quality, especially if you've got thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people implementing, right? In some cases, the education system, for instance. And so the reality also with scaling is that you're going to have lower visibility on the implementation. It's just a reality that it's hard to keep track of thousands and thousands of implementers all the time. And so if you know that from the start, you can design for hopefully a very high level of effectiveness. When you're working at that smaller granular level, knowing that, your effect size might decrease when you are working at scale. But hoping that that effect size is still quite meaningful for the populations that are participating or receiving the intervention. And sometimes that is a compromise that an NGO, government partner, and private sector funder is going to have to think through.
Yeah, and I think also, what often can get lost is that human element here, right? So, like all of the relational trust that is built, the community voices, as well as the responsiveness that can really make those innovations so effective from the start. And so when programs are able to move into bureaucratic systems, there can be this tendency to standardize, and that can really kind of flatten out some of the nuance. And so one way really to hold on to that essence is to embed the lived experience that leaders have, and as well as having community champions within that system as you're working to scaling. And so also being able to create those mechanisms for that ongoing feedback and not just have that one-time evaluation people do, like those N9 evaluations, that can really help to keep the work grounded and much more dynamic as well.
That's great. I mean, so both of you actually really pointed out something really valuable kind of in both of your, I mean, lots of valuable things, but something really valuable in both of your points there, which is that full integration. It doesn't always mean better outcomes, right? It might mean wider reach and wider scale, but not necessarily better outcomes. And sometimes what matters more is how well the core elements are protected, right? Some of these kind of key kind of components, even in different or more decentralized systems, let's say. So I'm curious, Sue, can you share a little bit of an example from the case studies, perhaps, where a program didn't fully integrate into government systems, but still had that wide-reaching impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one that I think is an excellent example is the WEM Institute in Costa Rica, because their work on men's mental health is to really address gender-based violence from like a preventative perspective. And they didn't actually fully integrate into the public health infrastructure, but it really did reach that national impact through a lot of their public campaigns and training that they did with law enforcement as well as community leaders. And so they were able to achieve that scale through influence instead of through sort of this formal adoption process. And that really was able to show us that integration isn't the only pathway there is for public impact. That alignment as well as that amplification can be just as powerful.
Yeah, I'd also add Basic Needs, Basic Rights Kenya is another really extraordinary organization that's been working for many years in Kenya on mental health across the public sectors. So they've worked with not just one area, for instance, health or education. They're looking across policy. They want it to be cross-cutting. And one of the stories that came out of their work is that not all programs that they propose get directly adopted. However, they've remained agile in their relationship with government, maintaining that advisory and innovator relationship that we kind of talk about in the report as well. In terms of being able to be there to consult and advise the government in making decisions that touch mental health. And we think this is really important, not just to the earlier point of many community-based NGOs and social innovators have direct access to lived experience, especially in communities where they serve. They're able to bring those perspectives to the table, frequently those individuals to the table for purposes of advocacy and government listening. And this is a really critical move that they can always make if they're able to stay in that relationship with the government to continue to influence new initiatives and policies.
Thanks for that, Daisy. I wonder whether we could turn the conversation now to the whole question of best practices and policy. As you know, it's an area that has always interested me. Several of your best practices, for example, the reference to lived experience leadership or community buy-in, they don't fit easily into policy memos, do they? Into the policy framework, if you like. How do you ensure these softer elements are protected in public partnership? I wonder, Daisy, whether you'd like to jump in first.
Sure. So first, we think it's in the interest of both nonprofits or the civil society partner as well as the government to really deeply engage the population they're aiming to serve. That sounds obvious, but it isn't always included as part of the process, right? And this is especially true for mental health. Because the lived experience, the local context, all of those really influence, the inner experiences and dynamics that we have. If we think about mental health as, say, the way that we relate to the experiences of being a human, then of course the actual daily realities of communities are going to affect the way that they experience their own mental health, and particularly what kinds of interventions or supports would be useful to them. And so even if an organization comes in with a solution that has been, randomized controlled trial to death, it's really important for them to also think about integrating the community perspective and lived experience in a very serious way. And we believe that with mental health, it's very much possible to do this in the context, in the training, in the language that is being used, in the approaches that they take. And the last thing I'll say about that is, in democracies, we'd like to see governments serving people directly. And especially at the local level, when people see that the government is responding to their needs, that actually strengthens that relationship between the people and their government, which is a really important component of this as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I think what you said, it's definitely true, and what you've shared, Chris, and I think, what Daisy said is definitely important in terms of how we think about engaging the populations that we're looking to serve. And, as we think about this, things like trust and dignity and lived experience, they're just not things that are easily quantifiable, right? But I think those are the things that really can make or break the legitimacy that a program has. And that's where, you're getting the community buy-in, you're getting, the buy-in from the leadership as well. And so one strategy that we've really seen work is to make sure that you're also codifying some of those values in very specific partnership agreements, and not just the outcomes, right? So for example, you could require, advisory roles for, lived experience leaders, or you could think about, structuring your feedback in a participatory way into um, specific MOUs as well, or memorandums of understanding. And so, we've found that when policymakers really can see the, quote unquote, soft elements in action, even if it's just like sitting in on a community group, that can be so powerful, for them to really start to recognize that the value, um, and to really protect those more deliberately.
And it really, and when you think about kind of those relationships a little bit between kind of the community and the private sector as well, the public sector in terms of the government, one of the things that comes out to me is in the report, you introduce this idea that this public-private integration isn't linear, right? There's a lot of back and forth, and it can be very messy, right? And so I'm curious, from your perspective and the experience you've had with this research, can you talk a little bit about, why this is actually a sign of strength and not failure?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think one of the biggest misconceptions out there in terms of scaling mental health work is that there's somehow this like very direct or straight line from integrate or innovation to um, adoption by the government. And in reality, that integration really often happens in these kind of fits and starts. And so, programs can get piloted and then they might be paused for a while, then they might get retooled in some way, and then they may be reintroduced. And so having that back and forth isn't actually a weakness. It's truly a sign that the system is learning and adapting as the program is out there. And so, in fact, when governments are able to then circle back to civil society or to different grassroots leaders for that iteration, then we see that it can result in much more culturally relevant and sustainable solutions. And so the quote unquote messiness here really does reflect real engagement and not failure.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense to me. And I love this idea that, putting the values like, adaptation and constant learning and trust and lived experience, directly into the DNA of this partnership and, not just the metrics. I think that's an incredible approach. It does raise a little bit of a tricky tension, I think. I mean, these like relational, community rooted approaches, I mean, they take time, right? It could take decades. How do you make the case, I suppose? I mean, especially, to funders, let's say, a lot of what we think about Mind the Gap is the lack of funding within the sector. It's a very difficult space to engage in. So, so how do you make this case, especially to funders who Some of them want clean metrics, short timelines. They want to see, okay, I'm going to put $100 in and I'm going to see the impact directly on their other side. How do you make that case for this like messy, years long work that you're describing?
Yeah, I think, Christy, it truly is like one of the biggest tensions in the field, right? Is, this desire for quantifiable evidence out there. But, I think what we found is that storytelling and systems framing really can help. And so instead of just reporting out numbers, we show how those numbers really can fit into a much broader arc of systemic change. And so we also do try to break down that relational work into much more tangible milestones. How much trust has been built, how many policies have been shifted, how have we shifted those policies, how have we activated different champions. And so it can really help funders see the value of kind of the invisible part of the work as well. And more, we're also seeing that there are more funders who are willing to invest in that backbone infrastructure, and those long-term relationships, especially, when they are able to understand that that payoff is in the resilience and in the impact.
Yeah, and I would say, this is really hard work. There's no one that we interviewed who said, "Oh, this was easy. We washed our hands clean and we all live
Yeah.
now." It's just there aren't any shortcuts here. Um,
Mm.
uh, the organization that I run, Brio, we're going through this process, and so we experience the ins and outs of daily working with government officials and bureaucracies. And the thing that I would say is that, there is this perspective, this understandable perspective from the philanthropic and NGO nonprofit civil society sector that we might um, want this to kind of be the end goal, so to speak. And I would still just encourage us to actually see this as a totally different orientation than what we are trained to think about when we become leaders and teams in philanthropy or nonprofit work. And I'd also suggest to funders to consider the alternative. If you fund a program and these are just short-term timelines, you can fund it over and over and over again, and we thank you for that. But also, it may not reach the scale of global or even local needs if we just do that one project at a time, one grant for each project, et cetera, et cetera. And, for some funders and donors, that might be the kind of work that they want to be involved in that sort of short-term response, implementing a program. But for other funders, it might be more interesting to take that longer term view to say, if we can successfully integrate this into the public sector, then a few really great things might happen in our lifetime, right? The nonprofit gets to focus on continued innovation, and that's what they can do best with their size and their connection to the community. The government serves its people better. And we've got millions of people experiencing more flourishing and well being and positive mental health. So, isn't that worth a shot?
Feel like if I had a mic, I would drop it. Very couldn't agree more, Daisy. Couldn't agree more.
I was feeling a bit gloomy when you were saying with how much hard work it was. I'm very
But we're up for it.
yeah. Well, I'm glad you gave us a bit of an uplift at the end. That was good. So, Christy, I think we're going to start wrapping up, if you don't mind, Daisy and Sue. We're going to bring this to an end slowly. And I just wanted to make a couple of points and then hand over to Christy for the finish. But for all our listeners, we would really like you to make sure that you not only subscribe to this particular podcast, but that you make sure that other people learn about it as well, because of the incredible work that Daisy and Sue have done in this report and the work that they do beyond the report, which is incredible. We've looked at public-private integration. That was the first part of our discussion. And then the magic framework came, which actually is easier to look at in the report itself, I have to confess. And the way in which the framework is in a sense, a movable feast. In other words, elements of the framework can be, you can pass from one element to another and then back again if you need to, and then to the third, and so it goes on. So it's not only a framework in the sense of holding everything together. It's something of a matrix at the same time, and I think that's useful to understand in this particular formulation. The whole question of integration. Now we're talking here, of course, about public and private, but we're also talking about community, people with lived experience, and so on and so forth. And what I think was very fruitful today was the way in which we kind of got a bird's eye view of how a real life program feels and looks, and several examples were given. I'm obviously totally unbiased, so I was delighted to hear that you introduced basic needs, basic rights into the picture. But there were other examples as well, and there are super examples in the report itself. My favorite, best practices, best policy, the integration of best practice to policy, that kind of circuit between policy and practice. I think we very well covered today. And again, I think the outstanding aspect of this was the practicality of it. And so those of us who are prejudiced about government really need to start thinking and rethinking all over again, because actually government does carry the responsibility of working with its citizens long term. Not-for-profit organizations, the private sector in this context, may or may not be able to go all the way all the time. And so therefore, it's really important that the government not only plays its part, fair enough, but also plays its part in the context of best practice. And then we got on to the exciting and sometimes frightening aspect of financing and funding and so on and so forth. And without that good old Luca, we're not going to go very far. And that you made clear, as you did make clear, that this is not an easy, straightforward road, and that this is sometimes really hard work. And one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking with Christy was the whole question of communication. And unless there is really effective communication between the various parties, the framework won't actually work. That seemed to me to be really helpful. Christy, let me hand over to you.
I think it's an incredible conversation, especially in the context of this new normal, right, of global development, where you have some bilateral funders, shifting priorities. Really, what you've laid out here is a blueprint for how this public-private, collaboration could happen in mental health in order to really embed it within the systems from ground up and provide an opportunity and kind of a door for governments and other systems and other partners to, evolve what it looks like within their communities. And I just think one of the big pieces is, progress in mental health isn't linear, and therefore it's not always visible. It doesn't mean it's not happening. Sometimes the most powerful shifts, as you guys were sharing, they're built on trust, relationships formed, or systems quietly adapting, in the background. The small changes, the curriculums embedded in the schools, the things that make the shifts within the systems, come alive. And so really, closing the gap, it's not about arriving at a perfect model. It's about staying present within the process. And I think that really comes through in your report. And the real work happens within these spaces, right? Between innovation and policy, between community voice and government systems. And really what we're trying to do here, on this podcast with you all is try to make those spaces more visible, right? So we can learn from them, invest in them, ultimately try to make them smaller. So Daisy and Sue, it's been a real pleasure having you guys here. So huge thank you to you both. For sharing some of your reflections and contributing to the podcast today. We really appreciate the time that you've taken and the great reflections that you've shared. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having us. Such a great pleasure.
Thank you, Christy and Chris.
Great. It's been lovely having you with us. Thank you.